The morning started like any other on the farm. The sky was still dim with the first light of day, and the gentle breeze rustled through the trees. A sense of peace hung in the air as the rooster crowed in the distance, signaling the start of another quiet day. The farm, located far away from the bustling city, was Michael's sanctuary. After years of service in the military, he had chosen to leave behind the chaos and intensity of his past life. Here in the countryside, he found solace in the rhythm of farm life, tending to crops, feeding livestock, and enjoying the solitude. Michael had worked hard to build this life. It wasn't easy, but it was his. He had no interest in drawing attention to himself. The past was something he kept behind him. As a retired Delta Force commander, he knew how to survive in difficult circumstances, but he was far removed from the soldier he once was. He rarely spoke about his military days to anyone, preferring to be just another farmer in the eyes of his neighbors. His life was simple now, but it suited him just fine. On that particular morning, Michael woke up early, as he always did. The sunlight had barely touched the horizon, but he had a lot to do. He stretched and rubbed his eyes, his muscles stiff from working the land the day before. He made his way to the kitchen, where the smell of coffee filled the air. As he prepared breakfast, he glanced out the window, watching the cows graze lazily in the fields. Everything seemed calm, just like it always did. But as he stood there, a faint sound broke through the stillness, a low rumble of truck engines in the distance. At first, he didn't think much of it. There were plenty of farmers in the area, and sometimes they would pass by on their way to town. But this sound was different. It wasn't the usual hum of a tractor or the quiet rumbling of farm trucks. This noise was too loud, too heavy, and too fast. Michael's instincts immediately kicked in. Something was off. He stepped away from the window and walked over to the back door. He didn't need to look outside to know that trouble was on its way. Michael was used to threats, but not this kind. He had faced enemies in combat before, but this felt different. This felt personal. He slipped into his boots, grabbed his jacket, and quietly moved toward the storage shed where he kept his tools. His mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. It wasn't unusual to see people on his land from time to time, but this felt deliberate. The rumbling of the trucks grew louder, and soon enough he saw them. The vehicles, two old beaten-up trucks, came into view on the dirt road leading to his farm. They weren't moving like normal drivers. Their speed, their lack of caution, made it clear that something was wrong. Michael could see the outlines of men inside the trucks, but he couldn't make out their faces yet. He could feel his heart rate pick up, a steady rhythm of tension building in his chest. They were getting closer, and there was nowhere to hide on the open farm. It wasn't long before they would be right at his doorstep. He moved quickly but quietly, trying to stay out of sight. The attackers didn't know that Michael's farm wasn't just a peaceful plot of land. They didn't know that they were about to encounter something much more dangerous than they ever imagined. But Michael was prepared for moments like this. He had been trained for them. The question wasn't whether or not he could handle it, but whether or not he could do so without alerting the authorities. Michael didn't want to call for help. He preferred to deal with things himself, the way he had learned to do in his previous life. The trucks came to a halt in front of his house, and several men jumped out, quickly rushing toward the front door. Michael's mind raced as he observed them from behind a stack of wooden crates. There were 5 men in total, all of them armed. They were rough-looking, dirty clothes, scuffed boots, and angry expressions. Michael could hear them shouting as they approached the house, their words muffled by the distance but still loud enough to make out the intent behind them. They were here for something, but Michael couldn't figure out exactly what. He crouched low behind the crates, keeping his breathing steady. He knew he had to act fast, but he didn't want to reveal himself just yet. The men were focused on the house, unaware of the quiet observer in the shadows. As they reached the front porch, one of them kicked down the door with a single violent thrust. Michael's heart skipped a beat. The moment they stepped inside, he knew there would be no turning back. This wasn't a simple robbery. It was an invasion, but Michael was not just any man. The men who had just entered his home had no idea who they were dealing with. They assumed they were just robbing a farmer, someone who wouldn't fight back. What they didn't know was that Michael had faced far more dangerous situations than this. He had been part of an elite military unit, Delta Force, one of the most highly trained special operations forces in the world. He had survived the harshest of conditions and had dealt with far more lethal threats than a bunch of armed thugs. But none of that mattered now. His goal was to protect his home and his family without letting the situation escalate further than it had to. As the men began to ransack the house, Michael's mind worked in overdrive. He knew that they wouldn't hesitate to harm anyone if they felt threatened. He also knew that if he made his move too soon, it could backfire. He needed to be patient, wait for the right moment. He glanced around, taking stock of his surroundings. He knew this farm better than anyone, and he had spent countless hours thinking about how he would protect it if the time ever came. Minutes passed like hours as Michael listened to the men rummaging through the house. He could hear their voices, their footsteps, their grunts of frustration. They were looking for something, anything of value. Michael didn't know what they hoped to find, but it didn't matter. Whatever they wanted, they were not going to get it. Not from him. Suddenly, one of the men appeared in the doorway holding a crowbar. He looked out into the yard, scanning for anything suspicious. Michael's breath caught in his throat. The man was too close. He could feel the tension in the air. But instead of rushing in, he held his position. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. The man stepped forward, unaware that Michael was only a few feet away, crouched low and ready to strike. Michael's mind raced as he considered his options. He had to act fast. This was his chance. With the precision of someone who had trained for moments like this, Michael sprung into action. He moved with a speed and skill that the man never saw coming. In one swift motion, Michael took the crowbar from the attacker's hands, disarmed him, and brought him to the ground, all while remaining silent. The other men inside the house had no idea what had just happened. They were too busy searching through drawers and closets to notice their comrade being taken down. Michael didn't waste any time. He moved quickly, silently, taking out one man at a time. The attack was fast and efficient, just the way he had been taught. His movements were fluid, his mind focused entirely on the task at hand. Each strike was calculated, each movement executed with the precision of a trained soldier. The attackers had no chance. They were out of their depth, facing someone who had spent his entire life preparing for this kind of confrontation. By the time the last man fell, Michael stood in the middle of the room, breathing steadily. The attackers were no longer a threat. He had taken them down without breaking a sweat. But now, as he stood there alone in his home, Michael realized that his life was about to change in ways he hadn't expected. The men who had come to rob him would never forget the man they had underestimated, and neither would anyone else who heard the story. ChatGPT said, Michael stood over the group of men, his body tense, every muscle ready in case any of them tried to make a move. He had disarmed them quickly, taking them down one by one, but now they were all gathered on the floor, bound and helpless. The moment they were secured, Michael allowed himself a breath. The adrenaline had flooded his system during the confrontation, but now that the immediate threat had passed, his mind began to settle, yet his thoughts raced. He had seen his share of chaos before, but something about this felt different. These men hadn't just come to rob him. They had invaded his sanctuary, and that was something he wasn't about to take lightly. Michael moved toward the window, glancing outside to check the situation. The sun was rising higher, but everything felt still. The farm, once a quiet retreat, now felt like a battleground. He could hear the distant clamor of the trucks, the sounds of the men as they recovered from the shock of their defeat. Michael's calmness was a result of years of training, but even he could feel the weight of the situation now. These men weren't just amateurs. They were dangerous. They had come prepared, and Michael knew that if they had the chance, they would strike again. Taking a deep breath, he walked back to the group of attackers, each one staring at him with a mix of disbelief and fear. They had come here thinking they would easily overpower him, but now they found themselves on the wrong side of the equation. Michael didn't speak right away. There was no need. He watched them, sizing them up, seeing the fear in their eyes, and he knew they were beginning to realize just how wrong they had been. Rick, the leader of the group, was the first to break the silence. He looked up at me. Chael, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. "You don't know who we are," Rick spat, struggling against the ropes that bound his wrists. "You don't know what we can do to you." Michael didn't respond immediately. He simply walked over to where Rick was sitting, crouched down in front of him and looked him in the eyes. There was no hint of fear in Michael's gaze, only calm, steady control. "I don't care who you are," Michael said quietly, his voice calm but firm. "You made a mistake coming here." The group fell silent. The other men shifted uncomfortably, sensing that their situation was far worse than they had imagined. Rick glared at Michael but didn't say anything else. Michael's demeanor was one of authority, and it was clear that he was in control now. He stood and turned his attention to the others, scanning their faces, each one showing signs of realization. They had been caught off guard and now they were vulnerable. "You should have thought this through," Michael continued, his tone unwavering. "You thought you could just walk in here and take what you wanted. But you're not dealing with someone who's going to sit back and let that happen." Rick sneered but said nothing more. Michael's mind, however, was still racing. He had to figure out what to do next. The group was still a threat, even though they were bound. Michael knew that if he wasn't careful, they could still find a way to turn the tables. He had to keep his guard up, stay alert. As much as he wanted to just call the authorities and be done with it, something told him that he needed to handle this situation in a way that would leave no room for retaliation. He couldn't afford to let them go without ensuring they wouldn't be back. He moved across the room, thinking. There had to be a way to turn the tide completely in his favor, to make sure these men would never think about crossing him again. But what? He needed information. He needed to know who they were and, more importantly, why they had targeted him. One of the men, the youngest of the group, spoke up, his voice shaking. We didn't mean to hurt anyone. We were just trying to get some stuff to sell." His words were hurried as though he feared Michael's response. We didn't know who you were." Michael glanced over at him, taking in the desperate look on the man's face. He could tell that the man wasn't like the others. He was scared out of his depth and clearly regretting his actions. Michael wasn't interested in showing mercy, but he could sense the difference in this man. The others were hardened criminals, but this one had been dragged into something he didn't fully understand. "Who sent you?" Michael asked, his voice low and steady. The young man hesitated. He glanced at Rick, then quickly looked back at Michael. We just needed the money," he mumbled. "We weren't supposed to go this far. We thought it would be easy. We were just following orders." Michael's eyes narrowed. Orders, the word stuck with him. This wasn't just a random act of violence, it was part of something bigger. But what? Who else was behind this? Before he could press further, Rick, still furious, tried to interrupt. "Stop asking him questions," he growled, his face red with rage. "He doesn't know anything. We're the ones who—" Michael cut him off with a simple gesture. The air in the room shifted as Michael moved closer, his presence overwhelming. "You're not in charge here," he said quietly. "I am." Rick fell silent again, a mixture of defiance and fear in his eyes. Michael wasn't interested in listening to Rick's threats or excuses anymore. He needed to find out what he could from the others and then make his next move. He turned back to the young man who was still shaking. "Who gave you the orders?" Michael pressed again. "You need to tell me now. This isn't just about stealing. This is about something bigger. I need to know who else is involved." The young man finally broke, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know their names, but they said they'd pay us well if we did the job. They told us to go after you, to take whatever we could. They said you wouldn't fight back." His voice cracked. "They said you were just some farmer." Michael's heart sank. He had suspected as much, but hearing the confirmation stung. Whoever these people were, they had clearly underestimated him. They had thought they could just send a group of amateurs to take him down to rob him, but they were wrong. "They're not going to stop, are they?" Michael asked, his voice more to himself than to anyone else. The realization hit him hard. This wasn't just a one-time incident. These people weren't done. Not by a long shot. The young man shook his head. "No, they said they'd be back if we didn't do it right." Michael's jaw clenched. He had been right to handle this on his own. There was no way he could rely on others to deal with this. These men weren't just thieves. They were pawns in a bigger game. Whoever was behind this had made a huge mistake by targeting him. Michael had spent too many years in situations like this to let it slide. There was no room for mercy, not now. "Get comfortable," Michael said to the men on the floor, his voice cold. "You're going to stay here for a while. When the authorities get here, we'll see what happens next. But don't think for a second that you've won. You haven't." The men didn't respond. They just stared at him, each of them aware now that they had underestimated the wrong person. Michael's eyes were hard, his mind sharp. He had a new mission now. He wasn't just going to stop these men. He was going to stop whoever was behind them, and he was going to make sure they never thought about crossing him again. The quiet stillness of the farm was shattered by the sound of approaching sirens. Michael had kept the attackers bound and secured in his home while he waited for law enforcement to arrive. He had used the time to think, to assess the situation, and to gather his thoughts. His initial instinct had been to act swiftly and efficiently, taking control of the situation before things could spiral out of hand. Now, as the police neared, he knew the hard part was only just beginning. He stepped outside to meet the officers, his boots crunching against the gravel driveway. The early morning air was cool, but there was a weight in the atmosphere, a sense of tension that couldn't be shaken. Michael didn't like the idea of relying on the authorities, but he knew that after what had just transpired, there would be no way to keep this under wraps. He had already dealt with the attackers. Now he had to deal with the aftermath. The police cars pulled into the driveway, their flashing lights illuminating the otherwise calm farm. Officers quickly exited their vehicles, some approaching cautiously while others scanned the area for signs of any more threats. Michael stood tall as they neared, his calm demeanor standing in stark contrast to the frantic energy of the officers. One of them, a seasoned sergeant, walked up to him and nodded. "You're the property owner?" he asked, his voice steady but curious. Michael gave a short nod. "That's right. I've got a few men inside who are trying to rob me." The sergeant raised an eyebrow. "You stopped them?" "I did," Michael replied simply. "I've got them restrained inside. They came here with bad intentions. I didn't let them get too far." The sergeant's expression remained neutral, but there was a hint of surprise in his eyes. "How did you manage that?" Michael didn't respond right away. He wasn't interested in explaining his past to this officer. The sergeant would get the story soon enough when the attackers were interrogated. "I handled it," Michael said, his voice calm but firm. "They're not going anywhere until you take them in." The sergeant nodded and turned to the other officers. "Get inside and check on the suspects. We'll need statements from everyone involved." Michael stepped back to give the officers space. As they entered the house, he stood outside, his thoughts drifting back to the young man who had cracked under pressure. The others had been silent, but that boy had given up information too easily. It made Michael wonder just how much he could trust what he'd said. If these men had come after him at the orders of someone else, then the danger wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He paced back and forth in front of the house, his mind running through the possibilities. He had always been good at reading people, understanding their motivations, their fears, their weaknesses. It was a skill he had honed during his time in the military. But these men, they weren't soldiers. They were just criminals, pawns in a larger game. And that bothered Michael more than he cared to admit. If they had been sent here for a reason, that meant someone out there knew about him, knew enough to send people to target his farm. That thought unsettled him. His past should have been behind him, but clearly someone had found a way to drag it back into the present. The sound of the officers moving around inside pulled him from his thoughts. The sergeant emerged first, his face serious as he approached Michael. "We've got the suspects under control," he said. "They're not going anywhere. But we need to talk." Michael nodded, gesturing for the officer to lead the way. He didn't have much to hide, and he knew that the truth would come out soon enough. As they walked inside, the air felt heavy. The room was still filled with tension, even though the immediate danger had passed. The attackers were sitting against the wall, still bound, their heads hung low. Michael could feel their eyes on him, but he didn't acknowledge them. Instead, he focused on the sergeant, who was already getting to work. "We've got a problem," the sergeant began, his voice low as he addressed Michael. "The men you've detained, well, they're telling a story, and it doesn't quite add up." Michael raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" The sergeant glanced over his shoulder at the men on the floor. "They're saying they were hired by someone they don't know well, but who gave them clear instructions to come here. They didn't know who you were, but they were told you'd be an easy target." Michael's stomach tightened, so the young man had been telling the truth. These men hadn't come to rob just any farm. They had been sent with a specific purpose, and that purpose had to be connected to Michael's past. There was no other explanation. "Do they have any names?" Michael asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Did they say who hired them?" The sergeant shook his head. "They're all giving conflicting stories. One of them says they were promised money for a job well done, but none of them know the person's name. They're not being very forthcoming." Michael exhaled, frustration mounting. These men weren't going to be helpful. The situation was getting messier by the second, but he wasn't going to let them off that easily. They had come here with the intention to harm him, and Michael wasn't about to let them walk away unscathed. He turned to face the attackers, his expression cold. "You're not going anywhere until you tell me the truth," he said, his voice low but firm. "Who hired you? Who's behind this?" One of the men, the one who had spoken the most earlier, shifted uncomfortably. His eyes darted between Michael and the officers, but he didn't speak. The sergeant stepped forward. "You need to start talking. The more you withhold, the worse it's going to get for you." Michael's patience was running thin. He walked over to the man and crouched down in front of him, his gaze steady and unwavering. "You don't have much time. The longer you stay quiet, the harder it's going to be for you." The man hesitated, but then something in his eyes shifted. He seemed to break, a look of fear passing over his face. "I don't know their name," he muttered, "but they said they'd take care of everything. Just told us where to go. Told us you'd be an easy mark." Michael clenched his fists. Whoever had sent them was still out there somewhere. It was clear that they weren't done. They were just getting started. And Michael knew that he couldn't let this go until he knew everything. He wasn't going to let anyone threaten his life, not again. The sergeant gave Michael a look, and Michael nodded slightly. "You'd better start talking," Michael said, his voice like steel. "I'll find out who's behind this one way or another." As the officer moved to gather more information from the men, Michael stepped back, his mind racing. He wasn't going to sit back and let this slide. This wasn't just about protecting his farm anymore. It was about something much bigger. Whoever was behind this was playing a dangerous game, and Michael intended to make sure he wasn't a pawn. The silence in the room felt suffocating. Michael knew that the next few days would be critical. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. The group of men had failed, but Michael could feel the storm that was about to hit. He wouldn't wait for it to come to him. He would go to it, and he would finish what had been started. ChatGPT said, the days after the attack were anything but calm. The police had taken the men into custody, but Michael knew that this was only the beginning of a much larger problem. The authorities had investigated the attackers, but they hadn't found any solid leads about who had hired them or why. Michael couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just a botched robbery. Whoever had sent these men knew far more about him than they should have, and that unsettled him deeply. Every morning Michael would rise with the sun, just like he always had. But now, as he walked through his fields and checked on his animals, his mind was constantly running over the events that had unfolded. There was a nagging question that refused to leave him. Why him? Why now? The farm had always been his sanctuary, a place where he could escape from the world. He had hoped that his military past, with its shadows and dangers, would remain behind him, but clearly someone had dug it all up again. He wasn't sure if it was a coincidence or something far more deliberate. Either way, it didn't matter. The fact was, there were people out there who knew exactly who he was, and they weren't going to stop just because their first attempt had failed. Michael tried to keep his focus on the daily tasks, but it was difficult. His mind kept returning to the faces of the men he had subdued. He could still remember the fear in their eyes, the way they had realized too late that they had made a mistake. But that was the past. He had dealt with them. Now it was time to figure out who was behind it all. One evening, as Michael was finishing up his chores, his phone rang. He hadn't been expecting any calls, so he answered it immediately. It was the sergeant who had been on the scene the day of the attack. "Michael, we've got a lead," the sergeant said, his voice serious. Michael's heart skipped a beat. A lead? That was exactly what he had been waiting for. "What have you found?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "We managed to dig into the background of the men you detained," the sergeant continued. "They weren't just random criminals. We found some connections to a local criminal group. But here's the interesting part. The group has ties to someone with a lot of influence. A lot of power." Michael listened intently, every word the sergeant spoke sending a ripple of unease through him. "Who are we talking about?" he asked, his voice low. The sergeant hesitated for a moment. "We don't have a name yet, but the group has been involved in illegal activities for years. Things like money laundering, drug trafficking, and other serious crimes. Whoever's running the show is someone with a lot of resources." Michael felt his stomach tighten. This was far bigger than he had imagined. It wasn't just a random attack. Someone had targeted him for a reason, and they were not going to stop until they got what they wanted. "I'll need more than just rumors," Michael said, his voice sharp. "I need specifics." Names, connections, anything. We're working on it, the sergeant replied. But we need your help. We've got some surveillance footage from one of the nearby towns. It shows the men talking to someone right before they came to your farm. If you can help us identify this person, we might be able to break this open. Michael's mind raced. This was it. The break he had been waiting for. I'll be there, he said before hanging up. The next day, Michael drove to the police station to review the footage. The sergeant met him in a small room where a computer screen displayed the grainy images from the security camera. The footage was far from perfect, but Michael could make out the men, those who had tried to rob him, standing near a car, speaking to someone. The face of the person they were talking to was partially obscured, but Michael could see enough to know that it was a man. He had the look of someone who wasn't worried about being seen, someone who had no fear of getting caught. The sergeant hit pause on the footage. "Do you recognize him?" he asked, watching Michael closely. Michael studied the image carefully. The man in the video didn't look familiar, but there was something about the way he carried himself that struck a chord. The way he held himself, the confident posture, it reminded Michael of someone from his past, someone he hadn't thought about in years. But he couldn't place the face. "Not yet. I don't know him," Michael said, his voice calm but filled with uncertainty. "But there's something about him that feels familiar, like I've seen him before." The sergeant nodded, understanding the hesitation. "We'll keep digging. We've got more footage from other angles, so we'll see if we can get a better shot of his face." Michael nodded, though he wasn't sure how much longer he could wait. His instincts told him that this man, whoever he was the key to everything. If he could figure out who he was, he would be one step closer to understanding why he had been targeted. Over the next few days, Michael tried to return to some semblance of normalcy. He continued to care for the animals, tend to the crops, and fix the fence that had been damaged during the attack. But his mind was never far from the mystery that had begun to consume him. He had always been able to trust his instincts, and they were telling him that something far larger was unfolding. It wasn't just about protecting his farm anymore, it was about something that could threaten everything he had built. One evening, as Michael sat on the porch watching the sunset and drinking his coffee, he heard the rumble of an engine in the distance. He squinted, trying to make out the shape of the vehicle. It was too dark to see clearly, but the sound was familiar. It was a truck, a large, heavy-duty vehicle. He stood up and moved closer to the driveway, his eyes scanning the horizon. The truck grew louder, and soon enough it appeared on the dirt road leading to his farm. As it came closer, Michael's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just any truck, it was the same make and model as the one in the footage. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Whoever was behind the wheel wasn't just passing through. They were coming straight for him. The truck slowed as it reached the entrance to his property, and Michael could see a figure behind the wheel. The headlights illuminated the area in front of him, and Michael's pulse quickened. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The truck stopped and the engine cut out. Michael took a step forward, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife he kept at his belt. He didn't know who was in that truck, but he knew they weren't here for a friendly chat. The figure inside the truck remained still, and for a moment everything was silent. Then the door to the truck opened and a man stepped out. Michael couldn't see his face clearly, but the way the man moved, slow, deliberate, told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't just another threat. This was the person behind it all, the one who had set everything into motion. And Michael knew that whatever happened next, it would be a fight for his survival. The man stepped out of the truck, his movements deliberate and calm, but Michael could see the confidence in his posture. There was no hesitance, no fear in his eyes, just an unsettling sense of control. Michael's instincts screamed at him to be cautious, to remain calm and observe. He didn't know who this man was, but one thing was certain. He wasn't here to negotiate. Michael stood still for a moment, his hand resting on the knife at his belt, but he kept it hidden beneath his jacket. He wasn't ready to make a move just yet. Instead, he took in the scene. The truck parked just a few feet from the driveway, the man standing next to it, studying him with an intensity that made Michael's skin prickle. The silence stretched between them. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the farm was now bathed in the faint glow of the moonlight. The only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. Michael could feel the tension in the air, as if something momentous was about to happen. His mind raced, trying to piece together what this encounter meant. This man had to be the one behind the attack. He had to be the one who had sent those men to his farm. Michael took a step forward, his eyes never leaving the stranger. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a few steps toward Michael, his boots crunching against the gravel. He was taller than Michael, broad-shouldered, and moved with a deliberate, almost measured grace. As he came closer, Michael could see more details. His face was hard, weathered like someone who had spent a lot of time in the field. His eyes were sharp, calculating, and they locked onto Michael with an intensity that made it clear he wasn't here to make small talk. "I don't think introductions are necessary," the man said finally, his voice low and calm, but with an edge that suggested he wasn't used to being questioned. "You know exactly who I am." Michael's heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was the person who had orchestrated the entire thing, the one who had targeted him and his farm. "But why? What did he want?" "You sent those men to my farm," Michael said, his voice steady but with a hint of accusation. "Why?" The man didn't flinch. Instead, he took another step closer, his eyes narrowing. "I didn't send them," he said, his tone cold. "They were just pawns in a much bigger game. But you're right about one thing. I am the one who wanted to see you. You're the one who's been causing problems for my operation." Michael's mind raced. He had been prepared for a confrontation, but this was different. He wasn't dealing with just any criminal. This man was someone with connections, someone who operated in the shadows. And Michael had clearly become a target because he had crossed someone important. "Your operation?" Michael repeated, trying to keep his voice neutral. "What operation?" The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Let's just say that I'm in the business of making sure certain things go smoothly. And people like you, people who think they can just slip under the radar, end up being a problem. I don't like problems." Michael took a deep breath. He could feel the tension rising, and he knew this conversation wasn't going to end with a handshake. He had two choices now. He could try to talk his way out of it, or he could prepare for whatever came next. His training, his instincts, everything he had learned in his past life, told him that this man wasn't interested in conversation. "It was a fight, and it was coming. What do you want from me?" Michael asked, trying to sound more confident than he felt. He needed information. He needed to understand what was at stake here. The man's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "I want you to stop interfering," he said, his voice turning sharper. "You're a liability. You've made things complicated, and I don't like complications." Michael's mind spun. He was no longer just protecting his farm. This was about something far bigger than he had imagined. The stakes were higher now, and he had no idea how deep this went. "I won't stop," Michael said, his voice firm. "I won't let you or anyone else threaten my life or my home." The man's eyes hardened. He took another step forward, closing the distance between them. "That's your choice," he said, his voice low. "But understand this. You've already made things worse for yourself. You don't know what you're up against." For the first time, Michael allowed himself a small smile. He could see it now. This man was used to getting what he wanted. He was used to being in control. But Michael had been in control of his own life for too long to let someone like him take that away. "I know exactly what I'm up against," Michael said, his voice unwavering, "and I'm not backing down." The man studied him for a moment, then took a step back, his eyes scanning the farm. "We'll see about that," he said finally. "But just remember this, you don't get to walk away from this. There are always consequences." Michael didn't reply. He didn't need to. The man turned and walked back toward his truck, his movement slow, almost like he was savoring the moment. He didn't even look back as he got in and started the engine. The truck rumbled to life, and within moments it was speeding down the driveway, disappearing into the night. Michael stood there for a few moments, watching the dust settle where the truck had been. The calm of the farm had returned, but only on the surface. He knew that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. This man had made it clear that there were bigger forces at play, and Michael had become a part of that game whether he wanted to or not. The weight of what had just happened settled over him like a heavy blanket. For the first time, he truly understood the depth of the situation. He wasn't just being targeted for his farm. He was being dragged into something much larger, something dangerous, and something that he couldn't just ignore. But Michael wasn't the type to back down. Not from anything. Not from anyone. As the night stretched on and the stars began to twinkle above, Michael sat down on the porch, his thoughts racing. He had a lot to think about, and the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let this man or anyone else take away the life he had fought so hard to build. He would find out who was really behind all of this. He would uncover their secrets, expose their lies, and make sure they paid for what they had tried to do. And when it was all over, he would make sure that his farm remained his, a place of peace, a place of safety, and a place where no one could threaten him again.